So remember, for question number one, if you're going to do it, you'll note that I have the pages down there for the myth of the cave on 67 to 71. But don't forget also that I have a handout. Well, come up and get one then. Well, I asked people and they weren't paying attention. Well, those are together. No, that's the same thing. All right. So what I was going to say is, remember that you have a handout that we went over, giving the various, giving both interpretations of the allegory of the cave, the way it illustrates. And again, myth of the cave, allegory of the cave, parable of the cave. For our purposes, those are interchangeable phrases, even though they really don't mean the same thing. But, and this is a quote from a different translation. Oh, and also remember, for some of these early things in supplemental readings, I have the selection from the book, so if you still haven't gotten your book, you can do it in supplemental readings. Plus in 527, and this is an honor basis thing, there are some past editions of the text that you can check out overnight, photocopy what you need, and bring it back. That's in 527. Okay, so yet for the prisoner's reality would consist of nothing but the shadows. So here, approaching a question like this, you're not asked to analyze an argument, but you're asked to analyze what is meant by this belief, And so, again, as we said when we went over the writing, you want to assume that your reader is intelligent but ignorant of the specific subject matter. In other words, you don't want to write this as if you're a fellow colleague, a fellow philosophy professor, kicking out an email to me where both of us are assuming a lot about what we already know as part of our background knowledge on the allegory of the cave, and then you're jumping right in to some technical point about it because it's one professional philosopher talking to another. No, you have to assume that you need to bring the reader up to speed. So, you would want to introduce this. You'd want to relate some of the allegory of the cave. This is why you need should have it either in your text or read the version that's in supplementary readings, and how it is that for the prisoners, the shadows are the most real things. And, well, obviously, what could get them to alter or question this belief? Some of this has to do with their being confronted by a philosopher, which we saw that's what the guide represents, and led out of the cave. And here, I tell you that you can direct your essay to one or both interpretations. In other words, I say, how does the allegory give us for Plato a picture of ultimate reality? In other words, you could discuss the allegory as it relates to Plato's theory of the forms. And remember, that's one of the PowerPoints that we went over. Or you can talk about it in terms of philosophy's critical function in having us confront and examine our unreflective, culturally conditioned beliefs, the ones that we just soaked up by being immersed in the views of our own culture or of a particular culture. So you could do one or the other. Again, as I said, you want to review the handout on this, but those are some of the things that you like to do. Now, this more or less calls upon you to describe the meanings of the allegory. Now, some of these questions call upon you to weigh in, but here again, if you weigh in on one side or the other of one of these questions, you want to first introduce things. So I am looking for your opinions on some of these. But again, remember, one of the reasons you're writing this essay is to demonstrate that you've done your homework, that you understand some of what you're writing about. So never lose sight of that. Okay, so what does Socrates imagine that the laws of the city would say to him if they learned that he was planning to escape? Now, here I have a lot of different things. Part of the handout that's on Blackboard for the Crito, remember, this was the discussion that Socrates had with his followers when Crito and one or two others of Socrates' followers came to him in prison with a plan to bribe the guards, essentially, and get him out. And Socrates, do you recall if Socrates thought he was justly convicted, or if he thought the charges were trumped up charges? No pun. Pardon? Well, that's why do you think he would think that they were right in convicting him and sentencing him to that?
I think that because he was going against their beliefs and stuff. So I guess for him to do that, he was wrong.
Yeah. Well, again, we didn't read the Apology, where Socrates goes into this in detail, but he does not believe he's sentenced justly. He thinks these are trumped up charges, the kind you could level against any philosopher, and so he does not believe himself to be sentenced and convicted justly. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that he thinks he's justified in accepting his friend's plan of escape. So, now here again, you might give some background if you were going to answer this question on just what some of the reasons were that his friends gave to him for wanting to escape. They say things like, think about how history is going to think of us and of you. Socrates, you wouldn't want him to think that we weren't very good friends because we didn't even try to bail you out. On the other hand, they say, well, Socrates, think about what history is going to say about you. And they appeal to, Socrates was a really manly man, so to speak, right? And they say, look, you wouldn't want people to think that you're a wimp for not even trying to escape. And all these are given in that selection. Plus, they say, look, it's what seems or what may seem like a lot of money to the guards. And I'm going over this quickly because we'll go over this in more detail when we actually do the review. But I'm trying to highlight on some of the things you might want to focus on if you write on these questions, but also do some review. So they say, look, what might look like a significant amount of money to the guards doesn't look like much to us, because a lot of his followers were wealthy, right? Those were the people who were able to follow Socrates around Athens, people whose parents had means and who didn't have to help mind their parents' store all day or get up at the break of dawn to feed the animals, So at any rate, so his friends say, look, you're not going to set us back financially, and they try to argue that the repercussions won't be much. Also, Socrates, even though he's old, he's 70, we mentioned that, he has a wife that's more than 20 years younger and some young kind of middle school age sons. And I say, Socrates, wouldn't you like to be around to, help bring up and raise and educate your sons? So his friends give him some reasons why he should escape, but Socrates says, well, what if the laws came? And here it's as if the laws were a person, and what if they could have a discussion with him? What would they say? Well, first of all, remember that at his trial, Socrates had the option, after the jury voted him guilty, he had the option of proposing exile as a penalty. Now, the jurors wanted the death penalty, but Socrates could propose a counter penalty, a small fine or exile. And if the jury then was like juries today, they would likely vote for the lesser of the two unless they thought it was a particularly heinous crime. And if the jury had voted at his trial for a proposed penalty of exile, then Socrates could have gone into exile with the city's permission. The court system would have done its job, and no one would have thought there was anything wrong with that, except maybe his prosecutors. But he did not propose exile. Anybody recall what he did propose as a counter penalty? And it's been a while since we discussed this. Well, we already saw that Socrates was a very confrontational guy. And he says, look, I think I'm being unjustly tried and convicted. So he says, I don't deserve a penalty at all. He mentally mulls over a small fine, but he says, I don't even deserve a small fine. And then he gives a very in-your-face reply. He says, you want a penalty? Here's a penalty. You have this lavish state dining hall where the political bigwigs in Athens can eat for free on the state's dime, and where, as a way of honoring past Olympic athletes that represented the city well, you give them a state pension. You can't eat a laurel wreath. Back then, there weren't any Nike shoe contracts. You couldn't get your, if you won something in the Olympics, you couldn't make a ton of money by getting your photo on a Wheaties box. So the states would, and the various cities would do things like honor their Olympic athletes by giving them free meals for life. So this is what Socrates says: give me free meals for life. Give me a state pension. Because he says, look, the work I'm doing for being a gadfly, like a horsefly, and trying to wake you up by confronting you daily about your beliefs and the reasons you hold them. He says, this is such a valuable work, I shouldn't be worried about where my next meal's coming from. Well, how harsh a penalty is that? Well, you can tell it's no penalty at all, right? I mean, if I said, look, give me free meals for life in the congressional dining hall on the state's dime, nobody would call that a penalty. So the jury didn't have much of a choice, and they voted for the death penalty. So why go into all that? Well, the point is, now the legal system has said, Socrates, you've been convicted and sentenced to die, and that is, your sentence. And that is what the whole court process has determined you should get. So the point is, now, if he were to accept his friend's offer of escape, he basically would be undermining everything that the courts have decided. He would be, rebelling against that, were he to now allow his followers to bribe the guards and get him out of prison. So Socrates, and we'll see this. Oh, hold it. Well, basically, I'm also going to give out the other sheet. Let's do that now. Okay, let me take off the pause. So, if you look at your review sheet where it says some Crito arguments, basically, I'm going to skip through some of this, but in the first set of arguments, he says there's a general moral principle that we shouldn't harm someone else who's innocent. And then he looks at the state as if it were a person who could be harmed by something we did. And so he says, well, wouldn't I harm the state by taking actions that went against the verdicts of the courts and what the laws say? So he says if he escapes, he'd harm basically the state, so he shouldn't escape because he shouldn't harm the state. Now, Socrates argues also that the state has been like a parent to him, and the laws have enabled his parents to get married. He was educated according to what the laws say. So if he escaped now, it would be like disobeying a parent as an authority figure. Plus, Socrates argues that a child is not on the same level as its parent, and he says just as that is so, it also is not the case that an individual private citizen is on the same level as the state. Remember, the state and the city here are one and the same. These are called city-states. In other words, even though they were cities in Greece, they were like separate countries. Athens was very different, so different from Sparta. Even though they were different Greek cities, they may as well have been two separate countries. And so at any rate, to get back to this, the idea is, if the state is like a parent, Socrates gives what I think is not a great argument, and I've got another question that also speaks to this, and that is that if we're not on the same level, just as a child isn't on the same level as its parent, Socrates says, would a child be justified in striking out against a parent who punished them unjustly? And the answer he's looking for is no. And so he says, even if I'm in jail and I'm being punished unjustly, Socrates says, I still wouldn't have any right to strike back at the state. Now again, you don't need to use all of these, but look them over, refresh these in your mind. I'm not going to read each one individually now. We may do it in more detail when we go through the sheet. But, the third argument Socrates brings, and by the way, something to keep in mind is that the opinions, public opinion, the opinions of the many do not matter to Socrates, because he uses the analogy of an Olympic athlete. Who should an Olympic athlete listen to? Their trainer, who's a specialized, very knowledgeable person about what they should do as an athlete to prepare themselves? Or should the athlete listen to the average person in the street, to the opinions of the many? Well, if the opinions of the many say, well, you ought to have a cheeseburger now and then, and your trainer says, stay away from red meat, you gotta... So, essentially, Socrates is saying, we want expert opinion here, but in moral matters, who is the expert? Even though it doesn't say it, Socrates is the expert here, right? And so he says, I'm going to examine the reasons my friends give for staying, but he says, I'm going to decide this by looking on the other side and seeing what are the counter arguments to what my friends want me to do. And so what you see here where it says some Crito arguments are some of the arguments Socrates uses, all of which have the conclusion that he should not accept his friend's offer. So does Socrates see himself as being under any obligation to obey the laws of the city? Well, one of the things he says here, besides some of the things I already talked about, is he's voluntarily remained in Athens most of his life. Really, the only time he left was when he was a soldier in the Peloponnesian War. And he says if somebody voluntarily wants to stay in a city, when they could leave at any time, then he says they have an understood, a tacit agreement to obey the laws of the city. In other words, if Socrates didn't like the way the Greek system of laws and the court system worked, he could have left. But he didn't. And so Socrates looks at himself to be under an understood agreement. Well, I went into maybe more detail than I should, but, you can single out some of these as, but especially the laws say you would destroy us and the city, because he says, what would happen to a city if the laws and the court systems could be overturned at will by private citizens? Excuse me. I'm getting over a cold or something. Okay. So why would he think himself... okay, so he does think himself under obligation. So those are some of the directions you could go in. 3 also relates to the Kritos stuff, especially in the area of civil disobedience to law. So we saw that Socrates thinks that even if you're punished unjustly, you have no recourse but to plead with the state, but you shouldn't do something against the state. Whereas, we have the views of Martin Luther King, and here, I don't have a separate handout on it, but remember, if you weren't here that day, we focused in Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail on the part of that letter where he tries to distinguish a just from an unjust law. Because he's dealing with questions from fellow clergy that say, well, some things in the New Testament say that governments are instituted or allowed to be there by God, and that Christians should basically obey the government that's over them. So they say, how is it, Dr. King, that you feel justified in obeying some laws but disobeying others, like the segregationist laws that he was fighting there in Birmingham? And his answer is, he cites Augustine, who says that an unjust law is really not even a law. And then he gives several characteristics of a just versus an unjust law, and this was the thing that we did in small groups. Anybody remember what some of those characteristics were? What does a just law do?
It's something that agrees with all people, right?
Well, close. If it's passed by a majority on a minority, it's a law that the golden rule applies to. In other words, it's a law that the majority themselves would be willing to live under. And an unjust law is a law passed by a majority on a minority that the majority would not want to live under. Remember his point about upholding human personality? Again, we went over these. You might look at your notes. But you'd want to go back to your notes or back to the original letter. And here again, at least at the start of the semester, I put some of the things we're reading in supplementary readings. So if you still have not gotten your book for whatever reason, one, you can either check out one of the copies there and photocopy it, or you've got the whole letter, more than is printed in your book, in supplemental readings on Blackboard. But again, there's a lot in that letter, but philosophically, probably one of the most interesting parts is this part where he talks about distinguishing a just from an unjust law. Because we see him doing conceptual analysis, which is a part of what philosophy, part of the critical functional philosophy, is not just looking at what are the reasons, pro and con, but looking at basic concepts and saying, well, what should we understand by some of the most basic concepts we use, like justice and like a just law. So again, he says a just law upholds and affirms human personality, and unjust law degrades human personality. And he says segregationist laws hurt both the ones who enact them, because they give them a false sense of superiority, and the ones who have to live under them because they are given a false sense of inferiority. So it damages the personalities both ways. And Socrates also thought that his prosecutors in prosecuting an innocent man were in the end going to hurt themselves more than they ever could hurt him. In other words, for Socrates, there literally was a fate worse than death, and that is damaging your soul so that you have a bad afterlife. So I mean, these are some of the things, but you know, Dr. King seemed much more willing to go against laws that he thought were unjust than Socrates did. So I ask you whether you think he would there. And there's more than one way you can go on 3. But now, 4, I've already went over a number of this stuff. On 4, you'll see that there are several arguments where he says the state is like a parent and he's not on an equal footing with its parents. You know, at least Socrates says that. And then I say, well, in your opinion, would Martin Luther King have accepted Socrates' reasoning on this point for enduring an unjust punishment? In other words, Socrates says we're like a child compared to its parents, and even if a parent punishes a child unjustly, the child has no right to strike back in retaliation. So Socrates says he would be retaliating against the city if he accepted his friend's offer of escape, so he shouldn't do that. Now again, I'm going through some of this stuff fast because I'm recording all this stuff. Now, okay, so those are some of the things that relate to some of the first things we did. 5 relates to and wow, this is bad. I don't have, you know what? I don't have an essay question specifically. Well, actually, I do, because question 1, if you choose the question, the interpretation for Plato's forms, that would be an essay question that would speak to his view of reality. So remember, you do want to review the forms PowerPoint, and if you haven't, you know, looked at some of the Tegrity recordings, again, you might want to do some of that. But at any rate, your book lists, late in that reading, the Nicomachean Ethics, on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, some of the various virtues that Aristotle covers. And so you want to look at that, ask yourself, how did he portray these as the mean between extremes? So temperance or self-control, courage, liberality, which we really refer to more nowadays as generosity, and even wittiness he thinks of as a positive character trait. Now there are some others listed, but these are some of the main ones, and they fit the model of a mean between extremes. Now remember, not everything can be portrayed this way. For Aristotle, it's not a moral virtue to be a murderer if you make sure that you only murder in moderation, or to be a thief if you only steal in moderation. And he says some actions are always wrong, and he even puts adultery, being unfaithful to a spouse, in that same category. No such thing for Aristotle as adultery being a virtue if it's done in moderation, right? But some of these other virtues are the mean between extremes. So remember that PowerPoint on Aristotle's virtue ethics gives you his views of the mean. And if you turn your review sheet over, remember I talked about reprinting a PowerPoint in outline mode, so you just get the text. Well, that essentially is what I did. I realized Aristotle's Virtue Ethics, the title of it is the last thing on the page before that, but basically what you see is the content of that PowerPoint. I'll print it out for you in outline mode. So it gives you a way of going down and making sure you're clear on the various points of it. And we will cover this in more detail either Wednesday or Friday. And that's okay. I spent a little more time, but okay. Number 6 basically is also one on Aristotle's virtue ethics, but instead of discussing particular virtues and what he meant by them and how they might be portrayed as a mean between extremes, 6 asks you to weigh in yourself on his claim that we can develop virtues much in the way that we would develop a skill like playing an instrument, or a skill at a trade like carpentry or building. Here again, you don't want to just go directly into your view saying, yes, we can develop them, or no, we can't, and here's why. But, you want to give some background on what Aristotle meant before critiquing him. And this goes along with, some of the guidelines in that handout on writing an essay, that we looked at. So remember that handout's there in supplementary reasonings as well. Okay. Look, thank you very much for coming, and so we'll do review Wednesday and Friday, and the test is a week from today. Make sure you buy your Scantron, bring a number 2 pencil, although I have some. And you want to get your essay in on time because there is a 10-point deduction for late essays. Thanks, and if thank you. No, I believe it's the 9th. Isn't it the 9th?
Is it Monday?
Monday. It's Monday, whatever it is.
Okay.
What is Monday? Is Monday's the 9th.